There will be spoilers for the 1,000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to follow. Well, well, well. I don't want to say I told you so, but in all seriousness, of course this news breaks after I just released a video walking back my prediction that Cour 2 would end with chapter 611. Am I allowed to take that back? How does that work? What are the rules? Well, I'm running with it and no one can stop me. But for those of you who don't know what's going on, I mean, what on earth am I talking about? Well, on Kubo's exclusive platform Club Outside, he revealed just yesterday that they're nearing the final stages of dubbing for the anime's second season, and the focus character they're working on this week is none other than Ichibei Hyosube. Continuing, Kubo explains that he's been collaborating with series composer Shiro Sagisu on a particular track named Monk's Shrine Technique. So what's the big deal? After all, a track called Monk's Shrine Technique could be fairly innocuous, right? Maybe it's just referring to something Ichibei uses when training Ichigo and the others. Except when you look at the Japanese translation, the intent becomes much clearer. The soundtrack's name is actually Futen Taisatsuryo, the very name of Ichibei's last-ditch technique he uses against none other than Yhwach himself. If this information is accurate, all signs seem to point to this fight being a part of the second Cour, and as I predicted before, the Cour very likely ending on chapter 611, with Yhwach stabbing the Soul King. Like I said, I do think this is a very fitting cliffhanger. It's easily the biggest, most shocking moment of the story at this point, the sudden realization that despite their efforts and intentions, Ichigo and his friends are already too late, and the Bleach universe now teeters on the brink of oblivion. But the big issue with this is that to get to 611 in a mere 13 episodes, we'll probably be moving at a seriously breakneck speed once again. There is loads to cover here. Essentially the entire second invasion in one go, including areas of the story that desperately needed expansion, like the much anticipated battle between the Zero Division and the Schutzstaffel. They'll be covering approximately 70 chapters of material in the one Cour, which sounds like an awful lot, though I'll remind you that is pretty much the exact same cadence at which the first part of the anime moved as well, taking us from chapter 480 to chapter 542. Things are slightly different this time around, however. Where part 1 featured a lot of plot, dialogue, and moving parts, part 2 will almost be a straight sequence of battles from start to finish, and with battles often taking up less time due to limited dialogue and fast-moving scenes, it makes sense that they've decided they've been able to find the space here to add new content. And so, in this instance, I don't think it's all doom and gloom if the series is really moving this quick, and to be honest, I'm not sure this track title is even full confirmation of Ichibei vs Yhwach being here at all. Who's to say they won't just use the track elsewhere too? Even if the track is titled Futen Taisatsuryo, there's nothing to say it won't be used during other Ichibei heavy scenes, such as when he's training Ichigo in the inner sanctum. It just means Futen Taisatsuryo is likely the biggest scene in which this track is being used. It doesn't necessarily confirm it's happening in this very Cour. But regardless, it does leave us with a lot of questions again. We know that the 1,000-Year Blood War anime is being split up into 4 parts, but if the second Cour really does end with chapter 611, then it seems they're taking the approach of breaking the 1,000-Year Blood War into 3 distinct sections: the first invasion, the second invasion, and Varvelt, which does make sense. Though I did also speculate that Cour 3 is likely in need of some serious expansion too, particularly surrounding Ukitake and his key scenes. But then, if that is the case, what does this all mean for this mysterious Cour 4? So, up next, let's break down exactly what we'd be getting in Cour 2 and how this can possibly work in a satisfying way, because I think it can. So, the battles that take place in the second invasion are as follows. Are you ready for this? Toshiro and Matsumoto versus Basby, Soifon and Omaida versus BG9, Toshiro versus Kangdu, Bambietta versus Komamura, Rose and Kensei versus Master Masculine, Renji versus Master Masculine, Rukia versus Asnot, Yachiru versus Gwenael, Kenpachi versus Gremi, Ichigo versus the Bambis, Ichigo and the Gotei 13 versus the Sternritter, Mayuri versus Giselle, Byakuya versus Pepe, the Zero Division versus the Schutzstaffel, and finally, Ichibei versus Yhwach. Also, while not really battles per se, scenes between Mayuri and Askin and Kyoraku, Nanao and Hashwolf are also involved as well. All of this is on top of a possible battle happening between Ichigo and Uryu, which I'm now beginning to question a little bit. Speaking of which, where on earth does a brand new fight fit into all of this? Let's start with some of my previous theories based on what we did and didn't see in the trailer. Moving down this list of fights, we can clearly see from the trailer that most of them will happen in some form at least. I was personally hoping for extensions to both BG9 and Kangdoo's fights, and to be honest, it can still happen. Bear in mind that many of these fights are over in a flash in the anime. Multiple pages of a chapter can easily be conveyed in a matter of minutes. It's not the same length, relatively speaking, so I'm optimistic that we might get at least a little something extra from these characters that we didn't see before. Perhaps the best example from part 1, showcasing the difference in pacing between the source material and the anime, is none other than Kenpachi versus Unohana. In the source material, that fight lasts from chapter 523 to 527, and in the anime, chapters 524 to 527 were all covered in the space of merely half an episode, with a substantial amount of added choreography and scenes, particularly involving Unohana's bankai. Due to those chapters being very fight-heavy, the anime was able to include them all, plus more, and I don't think anyone was disappointed with how it turned out. Carrying on, certain tentpole fights were completely hidden from the trailer, but we are 100% certain they are happening. Renji versus Mask, Rukia versus Asnot, Kenpachi versus Gremi, and potentially, yes, even Ichibei versus Yhwach, which makes you think they'll all be getting some form of special treatment. Meanwhile, thanks to the cast list, we know Sternritter V, the Vanishing Point Gwenael Lee, doesn't seem to have a voice actor attributed to him, despite him appearing in chapter 570. In my trailer analysis, I theorised he might be getting cut completely, instead kicking off the scene with Gremi appearing behind Yachiru and Isane, as happens in 572. And I think this is totally possible. Removing Gwenael cuts about 2 chapters from the run count, which feels totally negligible, and while it would be a shame not to see Yachiru in action, they could restructure it slightly to have her reveal her Shikai against Gremi instead, as she does try and attack him with it. Not only that, but the Priveron Espada were also confirmed to have voice actors in the cast list, meaning we were always likely to see at least some of the Mayuri versus Giselle battle, thereby making 587 a very unlikely endpoint for the Cour. If anything is getting cut or trimmed down during the latter half of the invasion, it'll probably be Byakuya versus Pepe. The fight is already a bit of a mess as it is, and it doesn't really add much at all. Though if that is the case, I wonder what they'll do with the characters involved, and it's so few chapters taking place from 594 to 597 that I wonder if it's even really worth changing it that much. But then just a second ago I theorised Yachiru versus Gwenael might get cut too, so who really knows? I guess the real difference between those two fights is how the surrounding context is affected if either of them are skipped. Yachiru and Isane can be confronted by Gremi regardless of whether or not Gwenael exists, but leaving Pepe unchecked would be considerably weirder. Maybe he'll just be taken out alongside Candice, Robert and Nanana if they need to speed things up. And speaking of which, in terms of off-screen fights, perhaps I'm being a little too hopeful, but I was going into this hoping to at least see some of Byakuya versus those 3 Sternritter, especially in the case of Robert, to get some action out of him, but now I'm not sure if that will happen at all. It also calls into question if we'll get any real extension to Renji and Rukia versus Bazbi at all either, as Yhwach's Alshvalen in chapter 603 renders most of the Sternritter down in the Seirete, unable to really continue fighting at all, and marks a shift in the battle that signals the end of the second invasion. I still think Shinji's Bankai slots in nicely into an extended version of chapter 581, and it's possible that that will be the major piece of new content we get in this core outside of the new fight. And Speaking of the new fight, where does it fit into all this? If it is between Ichigo and Uryu, which would still make the most sense to me, then it has to happen when Ichigo discovers Uryu has seemingly betrayed them in chapter 586. Perhaps Uryu fires his licked Ragen at Ichigo, who blocks it and dodges some of it, only to be hit by several of the arrows. Uryu then follows up by flying towards Ichigo and engaging him in battle as Yhwach and a doubtful Hashwolf look on. The two fight for a bit, with Ichigo continuing to try and get through to Uryu. Maybe we get another look at Getsuga Jujisho, though I can't imagine even an enraged Ichigo wanting to throw something like that at his friend. Eventually Yhwach summons Uryu back to him, and as he tries to leave, Ichigo maybe moves to stop him, only for Uryu to blast him with arrows once again, at which point Orihime arrives between the two of them, and the story continues as it did in the original chapter. When you lay it all out like that, it doesn't seem to really add a lot, outside of giving Uryu a well-deserved showcase. Honestly though, the big point of contention for me remains the same as it ever has: the battle between the Zero Division and the Schutzstaffel in the Royal Palace. Taking place from chapter 599 through to 604, there's so much potential for expansion here, and I won't lie, I will be genuinely disappointed if it isn't changed at all. God forbid they even go so far as to cut some scenes from it. I'm not saying I expect to see the bankai of each and every member of the Zero Division, but I'd love to at least see their shikai, even learn what some of them do, like Tenjiro's Kinpika, for example, which is just conspicuously left unexplored after its initial reveal. Of course, you don't want to reveal the shrifts of all the Schutzstaffel here in full, but they can be easily teased a little bit, unless we're expected to believe that Lille simply shoots all of the remaining Zero Division members immediately, which would be a big letdown. So I'm definitely extremely curious to see how that section pans out, if we're potentially not giving it the room to breathe in Core 3, as I maybe speculated in my last video. I fully expect them, however, to give Ichibei vs Yhwach the gravity it deserves, though that's a lot of major battles to have in the span of 13 episodes. It is doable. Next, I'd like to go over a breakdown of how the second invasion could be squeezed into 13 episodes in a way I think is satisfying and hopefully leaves room for some new content too. Bear in mind, this is just very much a rough draft that I have pretty quickly come up with, and it can be freely and easily amended if we think something works slightly better. As we theorised before, episode 1, which will probably span chapters 542 to 546, is likely to be very Quincy heavy, though it's almost disingenuous to really say that it's beginning with 542, since at best there's maybe 3 pages left of that chapter to cover. Still, we'll see Uryu being announced as the heir to the Vandenreich and what looks to be a new scene of the Sternritter all gathering to discuss it. I'll be honest, as I mentioned before, I have no idea how they'll handle introducing the Bambis as is done in chapter 544, since they seem to be appearing before that now anyway, leading me to believe they might cut Bambietta's, again, like I said, slightly suggestive scene, as they have been doing so far. We know from the cast list that Tatsuki, Keigo and Mizuiro should be appearing, so it seems likely we'll keep the scene of Kyoraku visiting them in the human world before the episode ends in reasonably the only way it could, with Yhwach invading the Soul Society. This is a difficult one though. Is this the episode we see some of Ichigo's training with Ichibei? Because chapter 547, which will likely open episode 2, starts with a brief glimpse of Ichigo within Ichibei's palace, so maybe it's here we'll see the training instead, and possibly hear this contentious theme of Ichibei's. It has to be fairly early in the core, as Ichigo is finished in the palace by chapter 555. Meanwhile, as for the rest of episode 2, it will either run from 547 to 551 or 552. 551 doesn't really feel like they've covered enough ground, but it could end with Kisuke announcing that he has completed a way to regain the stolen bankai, or probably more likely, in my opinion, they will go to 552, ending the episode showing Kangdu losing Daigoren Hyorin Maru. Now, admittedly, I think both of those endings would work really well as a cliffhanger, though I think seeing Toshiro's bankai explode out of Kang's back in a shower of blood would certainly be more dramatic. Regardless, episode 3, which I think could run from 553 to 557, is likely to be a tough squeeze. The first half of the episode will probably be dedicated to the defeats of BG9 and Kangdu after the captains get their bankai back, while the second half will show the transition to the next stage of the battle, including the first part of Komamura versus Bambietta. I think it would be a really tall order to fit all of Komamura's fight into this one episode, though definitely doable, as again, like I said, the fight scenes are overall less demanding on time. But at the same time, there are a few options here for what feel like great cliffhangers without stretching it so far that this fight would have to feel rushed. For example, 556 feels like a great point to leave people hanging, revealing human Komamura and having him activate his bankai, shedding its armor and unveiling its new corpse-like form. That would be a great way to end off episode 3 in my mind, but considering how cramped things are getting later on, it's possible they'll stretch through to 557 and end the chapter with Komamura landing the winning hit on Bambietta. Either way, it definitely seems like there's very little room for BG9 and Kangdu to be revived and continue fighting. I'd absolutely love that, as it still doesn't make sense for them to use their holy form for no reason, but I'm not counting on actually seeing them at this point. Episode 4, which I think would run from 558 to 561, is also pretty jam-packed. The first half of the episode features the remainder of Komamura's fight, rounding it off with the arrival of Renji and Rukia into the Seirete. The second half of the episode gives us the start of the battle against Masked Masculine, including an extended battle scene for Hisagi, Ikkaku, and Yumachika. And then the episode ends with the cliffhanger from chapter 561 and Renji's arrival to face off with Mask. Episode 5, running from 562 to 565, could potentially be a bit looser as we reach our first real milestone fight of the invasion, Renji versus Masked Masculine. The fight itself runs from 562 to 564, so there's plenty of wiggle room here for some extended scenes. Maybe even a slight extension of Renji using his new bankai, or a better look at his time with Ichibei. That being said, I think this episode would likely stretch to 565 in the end, ending off with Yhwach's backstory and him opening his eyes as dawn breaks on the next day of fighting. Episode 6, featuring chapters 566 through to 570, is of course another momentous one. Whether the anime cuts the Nanana and Renji scene or not, I'm not sure. I mean, it doesn't serve any purpose at all and is frankly a totally dropped plot point. That is, unless they decide to add a new scene later in order to follow up. However, the main draw of the episode is, of course, Rukia versus Asnot, which will be another major tentpole battle with potential for some extensions and additional choreography. I'm really hoping they retain Az's flashback, as it's really short, but they removed Royd and Lloyd's flashback, so I'm a little bit concerned about that. I think the episode most likely ends 3/4 of the way through 570, with Rukia following Byakuya away from the battlefield. It's possible, though, that we get a post-credits scene teasing the next battle setup. And then we have episode 7, we're kind of, about the halfway point through the core now, which would feature chapters 570 through to 576, though again, 570 is barely even going to be a part of this, and may not be a part of it if they do have a post-credit scene in the previous episode. But this, of course, is the first half of the massive bout between Kenpachi and Gremmy, so that's 3 potentially tentpole battles, 3 milestone episodes happening consecutively like that. That's going to be absolutely crazy. Now, as mentioned earlier, will Yachiru versus Gwenael be cut? If it is, that does free up some time. I've currently got this episode penned as ending on chapter 575, with Kenpachi lifting his blade to his face and saying it can finally start having a good time, which I think is a nice tease of what's to come. But if we remove the Gwenael fight entirely, then you can basically say goodbye to the last few pages of 570, the entirety of 571, and the first few pages of 572. Which would mean episode 7 is actually free to end on 576, with the meteor being summoned and Kenpachi calling his Zanpakuto's name, which would obviously be a fantastic cliffhanger. Frankly, even if Gwenael does still exist in the anime, they should push to end on 576 anyway. But honestly, this is where things get much harder to figure out. I think they are absolutely going to want to end an episode with Ichigo's arrival in the Soul Society. I mean, it's the perfect place to finish an episode off. Which means episode 8 might be stretched quite thin, possibly running all the way from 577 to 581. Luckily for them, the final few chapters of Kenpachi vs. Gremmy are very light on dialogue. For example, 577 will put the spectacle on Kenpachi's Shikai release, and there's very little dialogue involved there. That entire sequence could reasonably be wrapped up in 2 or 3 minutes, and the same as well goes for chapter 580, which is basically just 17 pages of the Bambis brutally murdering officers of Squad 11. The real sticking point is what do we do with Shinji's bankai? As I mentioned before, 581 seems like the natural point to include it, but I can't help but feel it would really affect the flow of everything going on. It's possible Shinji activates his bankai, says its name, and we see it close in around him before cutting away again, but this is definitely one of the tougher elements to organically include. A part of me thinks they might completely cut the scene between Shinji and Basby, which is an ironic twist of fate, considering I originally thought that was going to be the new fight in this core, and instead replace it with this moment. Shinji tells Hinamori and Omaida to make their way towards Zaraki, and then he holds off the advancing Soldat before we cut back to the rest of the chapter. And that brings us to episode 9, which will feature 582, all the way through to 587, although I think there's an argument to be made for bringing it back a little bit as well. But this features Ichigo battling both the Bambis and then the other sternritter who show up. This might be one of the fastest paced episodes of the core, as there is an awful lot to fit in here, and this is where it would really start to feel the pinch, I think. Especially if we're featuring a battle between Ichigo and Uryu in here somewhere. But I think this episode definitely ends with either Uryu ascending to the palace in 586, or Yhwach and the others actually crashing into the palace itself in 587. For the sake of this, let's say the battle between Ichigo and Uryu pushes things slightly so the episode has to end with 586. I like that a little bit more, I think it works a little better. This means that episode 10 is devoted almost entirely to the battle between Mayuri and Giselle once Yhwach and the others have left for the palace. It's difficult to choose an adequate cliffhanger here, and to be honest, I think it's potentially these next 2 episodes that might be the most tightly packed, if we want to end the core in a satisfying way. And I'll be brutally honest, I mean, who really cares about Byakuya versus Pepe that much? And as much as I do like the Mayuri versus Giselle fight, there's no denying some of the major fights in the earlier part of this core need to take precedence over this one, and so does the Ichibei versus Yhwach fight, so it's kind of caught unfairly in the middle here. That being said, there is definitely probably some room to stretch some of those earlier episodes a bit more as well. Like I said, this is very much a rough draft work in progress. Anyway, I like the idea of Zombie Hitsugaya's arrival being an episode cliffhanger, as it's truly a shocking moment that I don't think people would really expect, unless they make a bigger deal out of Giselle finding the unconscious captain a few episodes prior. That means episode 11, however, has to do a lot of heavy lifting, so I could see 10 ending on 592, where Mayuri challenges Hitsugaya directly. This means that episode 11 will stretch from chapter 593 to 597, and will cover the last section of Mayuri's battle, plus Byakuya's fight with Pepe, and then even the real start of the skirmish in the royal palace, ending on Ichigo and the others preparing to blast off to the heavens. That feels like a much better cliffhanger to me than seeing Nyanzol get skewered a chapter later, though I guess either one could work fine. But just reading that back, there is a lot going on in this one episode, but I kind of feel like that's the situation we'll inevitably end up in. And as mentioned before though, Pepe's fight is a real candidate to be cut down, and to be honest, so is the Mayuri versus Giselle fight, though I'm not exactly sure how, unless the slightly awkward ending of that fight is simply reworked to end earlier, especially if some of Pepe's fight is kind of just unceremoniously removed. Then we get to episode 12, the penultimate episode of the Cour, which is a big one, as it will feature the battle between the Zero Division and the Schutzstaffel, and will probably run roughly from chapter 598 to 605, though that sounds absolutely massive to me, so I'm not entirely sure how we'd be able to move things around a little bit there. And again, I'd love to see extensions here, of course, but just looking at that chapter count tells me there is an awful lot to fit in here. That being said, there are chapters here, again, that won't take much time at all. Oetsu's decimation of the Schutzstaffel in chapter 601 can't honestly take more than 3 minutes or so at the most to depict, for example, so I'm hopeful we might be able to see a little bit of extra action from both sides. And the episode would end teasing the battle to come in the finale, with the initial struggle between Ichibei and Yhwach, where Ichibei simply thinks he can cast the Quincy King down effortlessly. However, upon Yhwach's return, Ichibei resolves to kill him, as is the end of 605. This brings us to episode 13 and the final episode of the Cour, which is focused exclusively on the battle between Ichibei and Yhwach, giving it the time to breathe it deserves, featuring a span of chapters from 606 to 611. The end of the previous episode teased the showdown, with Ichibei deciding to kill Yhwach, and now the fight is on, eventually ending with Ichibei's death. Ichigo and the others arrive in the palace and rescue him, but they're too late. The Cour ends with the double whammy reveal that the Soul King hasn't only been stabbed by Yhwach, but that he's his father too. As you can see, it's not perfect. I started running out of room big time towards the end, but to be honest, I think if they're going to cut pieces from anywhere, it will be from the second half of the invasion predominantly, as that's where things get a little messy in general. Remember too that while each episode looks to have a lot of chapters packed in, that most of them are made up of fight scenes. They often take up considerably less time, meaning there's more room to play with here than we might think. But that was just my rough breakdown of the potential Cour. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments. But perhaps the biggest question left over is, what does this mean for Cour 4? If they really are taking the approach of splitting the 1,000-Year Blood War into only 3 sections, even with new content factored in, then of course that conspicuously leaves one final part left over. And yeah, if that is the case, I think it's almost certainly got to be an adaptation of Can't Fear Your Own World. Can't Fear Your Own World was designed in many respects to be something of an epilogue, or at least a direct sequel to the 1,000-Year Blood War, and I'm sure it could be structured in a way to fit the 13-episode format. Interestingly, it means Cour 3 would likely end with chapter 684 and Ichigo cutting down Yhwach before diving into Can't Fear Your Own World at the start of part 4, which would eventually end with chapters 685 and 686. Honestly, it would be so cool seeing Can't Fear Your Own World played out as a natural extension of the 1,000-Year Blood War story. I would absolutely love to see those character interactions really brought to life like never before. Maybe I'm being greedy now, but I'd also love maybe a single episode dedicated to some of the smaller supplementary moments, like Renji and Rukia's wedding, for example, from We Do Not Always Love You. Well, I wasn't expecting to be talking about this again, but here we are. While I still don't necessarily think this news proves anything, I'd also argue that the chances of Cour 2 ending on 611 have just improved dramatically. Here's hoping the team can manage all of these fights well. However, doing that breakdown of every potential episode in the Cour has kind of allayed some of my fears somewhat that it can be done. But I do just kind of wonder how much new content we might actually get, how many extensions we might actually see. Again, the key thing to remember is that fight scenes simply do not take up as much time as extended pieces of dialogue. So I'm hopeful that we'll still get basically what we're looking for out of this section of the story, but regardless, I can't wait to see it nonetheless. But that's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts about this news. Do you think it confirms Ichibei versus Yhwach and the Cour ending with chapter 611? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'd also love to hear your thoughts on my prospective breakdown of the potential entire Cour to come. I'd love to see if you think things could be moved around at all to free up some space, and where they might try and fit in some potential new content. All of those thoughts, please let me know down in the comments below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.